Have you ever pretended not to care, while secretly hoping someone would notice the silence you created? Have you ever told yourself that you were just busy, just distracted, just living your life, when in reality you were
Careful
waiting to
now,
see
these
if they would
flowers are
chase
delicate. Don't
you?
you
And have
worry,
ever
I've got
felt
a
that
good grip.
quiet, almost
I trust you.
intoxicating satisfaction when you
Careful
sensed that
now,
someone
these
was
flowers are
slightly
delicate.
afraid of losing
Don't
you?
you worry,
Be
I've got a
honest.
good grip.
Don't answer too
I
quickly.
trust you.
Because most people claim they hate jealousy. They describe it as toxic, immature, destructive. But if we look closer, beneath the polished surface of social virtue, we discover something uncomfortable. Many people do not hate jealousy.
By
They
the
hate
ancient
feeling.
powers, I
They enjoy
invoke
causing
thee!
it. They enjoy the proof that they matter. They enjoy the reassurance that they are not replaceable. And that is where emotional control begins. Not with cruelty, not with aggression, not with villains plotting in the dark. It begins with insecurity, subtle, human, almost innocent insecurity. The kind that whispers, "Am I enough?" The kind that fears being compared. The kind that fears being forgotten. Jealousy is not just an emotion. It is evidence of perceived value. It is the mind's alarm system reacting to potential emotional loss. When someone feels jealous, it means something matters to them. It means attachment exists. It means vulnerability has been formed. Now imagine discovering that you can trigger that alarm intentionally. Imagine realizing that by adjusting your attention, your tone, your availability, your social visibility, you can influence someone's emotional stability, that you can make them lean in closer, try harder, invest more, think about you more often. At that moment, emotion stops being spontaneous. It becomes strategic. And when emotion becomes strategy, emotional control becomes power. Tonight, we are not just exploring manipulation. We are stepping into the hidden architecture of human attachment. We are examining how emotional control transforms into a weapon, not always loud, not always obvious, but deeply effective. And more importantly, we are confronting the part of ourselves that participates in it. Because this story is not about monsters. It is about mirrors. There is a part of you that wants to be chosen, not politely preferred, not casually appreciated, chosen. Above alternatives, above options, above competition. That desire does not disappear with maturity. It simply becomes more refined. Instead of demanding reassurance directly, it seeks it indirectly. Instead of asking, "Do I matter?" it tests, withdraws, posts strategically, mentions other names in conversation, observes reactions. Jealousy lives in this hidden space, the space between insecurity and desire. It appears when you feel replaceable, when you sense comparison, when attention shifts, when energy changes, when messages slow down, when warmth becomes inconsistent. Jealousy is not weakness, it is fear of emotional displacement. And the darker side of psychology understands this better than most people understand themselves. Because if you can identify what someone fears losing, you can influence their behavior. If you can trigger the anxiety of replacement, you can increase compliance. If you can create uncertainty, you can intensify attachment. Emotional control begins with observation. The observant person studies patterns. They notice how quickly you reply. They notice how you react to distance. They notice what makes your tone change. They pay attention to your insecurities, often before you consciously admit them. Do you fear abandonment? Then distance will destabilize you. Do you crave validation? Then withholding praise will create pursuit. Do you compare yourself to others? Then subtle competition will consume your thoughts. Every human being has emotional pressure points, and pressure points can be pressed softly. The most effective manipulators rarely attack directly. Direct confrontation triggers defense. Instead, they create implication. They withdraw slightly. They become mysteriously busy. They introduce subtle comparisons. They shift tone just enough for you to feel it, but not enough to confront it. And here is the brilliance of implication. Your imagination does the work for them. You fill in the blanks. You create the scenarios. You exaggerate the threat. Your mind begins constructing possibilities. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe someone else is involved. Maybe I'm not enough. They did not say those words. You did. This is how emotional control becomes invisible. Scarcity is one of the oldest psychological triggers in existence. When something becomes less available, its perceived value increases. This applies to products, and especially attention. If someone who was consistently present suddenly becomes inconsistent, the mind does not relax. It intensifies focus. Scarcity activates survival wiring. Historically, losing access to a resource meant danger. Today, losing emotional connection triggers a similar response. The brain does not easily distinguish between physical and emotional threat. Both activate anxiety. So when someone strategically reduces availability, replies slower, shares less, appears socially engaged elsewhere, they are not necessarily busy. They may be engineering perceived scarcity, and scarcity fuels desire. Then comes comparison, subtle, almost playful comparison. My friend said something similar, Someone else mentioned that too. I don't usually connect this fast. These statements are small, but they introduce competition. Competition activates insecurity. Insecurity destabilizes emotional balance. Once destabilized, people seek reassurance, and reassurance often increases investment. Intermittent reinforcement deepens the hook. Warmth followed by coldness. Praise followed by silence. Intimacy followed by distance. This pattern mirrors gambling psychology. The unpredictability strengthens attachment more than consistent reward ever could. The brain becomes fixated on regaining the previous high, and the person caught in this cycle rarely calls it manipulation. They call it chemistry, they call it complicated, they call it intense. But intensity is not always depth. Sometimes it is instability. Social proof adds another layer. Visible admiration from others subtly increases perceived value. When someone displays attention they receive, casually, almost accidentally, it signals desirability. Humans are tribal. We are influenced by what others appear to value. If others want someone, our perception of their worth increases automatically. Controlled vulnerability accelerates attachment. Sharing personal stories creates closeness. But if vulnerability is timed strategically, offered just enough to create bonding but withdrawn before equality forms, it deepens emotional investment on one side. Emotional mirroring completes the illusion. Shared interests, shared humor, shared emotional intensity. It creates the powerful feeling of being understood, and being understood lowers defenses. Lower defenses increase influence. Finally, the unspoken threat of replacement seals the dynamic. Energy shifts, tone softens, presence decreases. Nothing explicit is stated, but something feels different, and the human nervous system detects threat before logic intervenes. At this stage, the targeted person often stops behaving authentically. They begin adapting, trying harder, monitoring reactions, modifying behavior to regain stability. That is the moment emotional control is complete. But here is the deeper truth. This dynamic does not only belong to villains. It belongs to anyone who has ever delayed a reply intentionally. Anyone who has ever posted with a specific viewer in mind. Anyone who has ever mentioned another person to provoke subtle reaction. Anyone who has ever withdrawn slightly to see if they would chase. The shadow is not evil, it is unexamined desire. Being desired feels powerful, and power feels safe. Especially if you have ever felt ignored, overlooked, or replaced. Emotional control often emerges from previous wounds, from earlier insecurity, from the fear of not being enough. If you do not examine that fear, you may weaponize it unconsciously. And this is why intelligence alone does not protect people from manipulation. Intelligent individuals often rationalize patterns. They explain away inconsistency. They defend behavior that destabilizes them, because admitting manipulation would mean admitting vulnerability. Humans bond before they analyze, we attach before we question. And by the time logic enters the conversation, emotion has already invested deeply. But awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize scarcity as strategy, its power weakens. The moment you identify intermittent reinforcement, its addictive pull decreases. The moment you notice subtle comparison, you regain emotional stability. Manipulation depends on reaction. It feeds on insecurity. It survives through uncertainty. The most emotionally powerful person in the room is not the most dominant. It is the least reactive. When you no longer compete for reassurance, jealousy loses leverage. When you no longer fear replacement, scarcity loses impact. When your self-worth is internally anchored, comparison loses meaning. True emotional control is not controlling others. It is mastering your own reaction patterns. And once you stop chasing emotional validation, something profound happens. You stop being controllable. You become steady, grounded, unshakable. And unshakable people are difficult to manipulate. Not because they are cold, but because they are aware. In the end, the real question is not how to trigger jealousy. It is why you need to. Why does someone else's insecurity make you feel safe? Why does provoking desire feel like proof of worth? Why does being chased feel more secure than being chosen freely? When you answer those questions honestly, emotional games begin to dissolve. Emotional control becomes a weapon only when insecurity holds it. When awareness holds it, it becomes wisdom, and wisdom does not manipulate, it understands. When we step deeper into the psychology of emotional control, we begin to realize something unsettling. Humans are wired to bond before they analyze, to attach before they think, and to respond emotionally before logic arrives. From the earliest moments of our lives, we are shaped by patterns of attention, care, and validation. The first time a caregiver responded, or failed to respond, to our needs, we internalized lessons about worth, desirability, and predictability. These early lessons become templates, subtly guiding how we react to attention and rejection decades later. Every human carries these templates into relationships, friendships, and social interactions. They are invisible maps of emotional vulnerability. Some people never notice these maps in themselves, Others exploit them knowingly. Emotional control begins not with overt manipulation, but with careful observation of these invisible maps. A slight withdrawal of attention, a delayed response, a casual comparison, all of these can activate deeply ingrained patterns of fear, longing, or competitiveness. To understand how emotional control becomes a weapon, we must first explore how attachment works. Attachment is not merely love, it is the unconscious system by which humans regulate connection and security. When we feel someone slipping away, even slightly, our nervous system responds as if survival itself is threatened. This is not metaphorical, it is chemical. Cortisol rises, dopamine fluctuates, heart rate accelerates, and our brain's reward circuitry ignites with a singular, unrelenting focus on the source of potential loss. Emotional control exploits this mechanism. By strategically activating attachment fears, a manipulator can guide reactions, thoughts, and even decisions. The first layer of this control is subtle observation. The manipulator learns your rhythm. When you respond quickly, when you hesitate, when your tone shifts. They notice which words make you anxious, which gestures make you eager, and which silences make you restless. Observation is the cornerstone of power because it transforms ordinary emotional responses into predictable outcomes. Next comes the art of implication. The human mind is a master storyteller. When someone implies a change, without explicitly stating it, your imagination fills in the gaps. They seem distant today. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe they are interested in someone else. And suddenly, without confrontation, your emotional landscape has shifted. Anxiety, doubt, and longing are now operating under the manipulator's influence. They have not touched you, they have influenced the terrain of your mind. This leads to one of the most potent psychological mechanisms, emotional dependency. Emotional dependency is not weakness, it is the natural consequence of repeated attachment cues combined with intermittent reinforcement. Warmth alternates with coldness, praise with silence, attention with withdrawal. The mind begins to crave the pattern itself. It does not crave the reward, it craves the cycle. Like a gambler's anticipation of the slot machine's outcome, emotional inconsistency hijacks the brain's reward pathways, and once dependency is established, behavioral predictability skyrockets. In this context, jealousy becomes a tool rather than a byproduct. When someone understands your attachment system, they know precisely which buttons to press. Subtle comparisons are introduced, not overt challenges, but gentle hints: someone else mentioned, someone else praised, someone else connected. These micro-comparisons ignite insecurity. They destabilize confidence, and in destabilized states, humans seek resolution and reassurance in ways they would not otherwise. Emotional mirroring enhances this process. The manipulator does not simply reflect your behavior superficially. They study it, internalize it, and echo it with precision. Humor, tone, posture, even word consciously, creates a sense of deep understanding.
Careful now, these flowers are delicate.
One of the most powerful
Don't you worry, I've got a good grip.
It lowers
I trust
defenses. It short-circuits rational skepticism, and in the lowered state, influence becomes almost effortless. Controlled vulnerability adds another layer of depth. The manipulator reveals carefully curated emotional fragments, enough to create bonding but never enough to equalize the relationship. This asymmetry is critical. You invest more emotional energy than they do, intensifying attachment and making influence more potent. You feel close, yet you are also chasing the depth that is carefully rationed. Every moment of connection becomes a reinforcement of the subtle power dynamic. Then there is the silent threat of replacement. This is the final unspoken layer of emotional control. Tone shifts subtly, presence is occasionally withdrawn, energy flows elsewhere. Nothing is explicitly stated, but the brain instinctively detects the signal. You are not guaranteed. You are at risk of losing connection. Survival instincts kick in, and in this state the person adapts. They change behavior, they try harder, they seek reassurance, they compete. And in this adaptive behavior lies the ultimate proof of emotional control. This architecture of control is remarkably precise because it is not arbitrary. Emotional responses are predictable when the underlying attachment wiring is known. By combining scarcity, intermittent reinforcement, mirroring, controlled vulnerability, and implied replacement, a manipulator can guide not just attention, but thought patterns, decision-making, and even self-perception. Yet, as profound as this knowledge is, it is equally important to understand that awareness disarms it. Recognition is the antidote. When you begin to see patterns, when you understand the mechanics of subtle withdrawal, comparison, and reinforcement, the emotional weapon loses its edge. You stop reacting unconsciously. You stop filling in imagined threats. You anchor yourself internally, and once anchored, the manipulator's strategies have little effect. Now, consider intelligence versus self-awareness. Intelligence alone does not prevent emotional manipulation. Highly intelligent people rationalize inconsistent behavior, excuse subtle tactics, and overthink interactions in ways that reinforce the manipulator's leverage. Self-awareness, on the other hand, disrupts the cycle. Self-awareness allows you to identify triggers, recognize asymmetry, and maintain internal stability. It creates a space where emotional control cannot thrive. Part of the danger of emotional control lies in its invisibility. Most people never identify when it is being applied. It does not manifest as aggression. It does not shout, it whispers. It exists in pauses, in timing, in subtle tone changes. The manipulator's power is in its subtlety, and the target's compliance is in unexamined patterns. Emotional control is not always malicious. Often it is unconscious, driven by human desire, insecurity, or previous experience. Yet the effect is the same. One person's reactions are guided by another's subtle influence. And once recognized, this subtle influence can be resisted. Once understood, the dynamics can be used to navigate relationships consciously, to establish boundaries, and to reclaim personal agency. This brings us to the paradox of power. True emotional control is not about controlling others. It is about mastering one's own emotional responses. It is about knowing when to invest attention and when to withdraw it from your own mind, rather than from someone else. It is about recognizing attachment patterns, both in yourself and in others, and consciously deciding how to act. When this mastery occurs, emotional control shifts from being a weapon used against you to being a tool used for self-empowerment. And the final layer of this understanding is profoundly liberating. Once you observe your reactions without judgment, once you recognize manipulation without internalizing it, once you stabilize your self-worth independently of others' attention, the dynamics that once controlled you collapse. Scarcity loses its power. Comparison becomes irrelevant. Inconsistency no longer triggers anxiety. Mirroring and vulnerability lose leverage, and the silent threat of replacement becomes inconsequential. At this point, you have moved from reactive to proactive. You no longer chase validation. You no longer compete for attention. You no longer fear being replaced. You anchor in your internal sense of worth, and in doing so, you transform from a potential target into an unshakable presence. Emotional control, once a weapon wielded externally, becomes a mirror of your own awareness and power. This is where most people never arrive. Most people react. Most people adapt unconsciously. But when you step into conscious observation, when you understand the architecture of attachment, desire, and insecurity, you gain access to a realm of freedom that few ever experience. And in this freedom, you no longer need to control others. You simply exist with clarity. You simply observe without fear. You simply respond rather than react. And yet, even as you gain this understanding, there remains a final challenge confronting your own shadow. Because the desire to be chosen, the subtle impulses to provoke attention, the small manipulations you perform unconsciously, they all reside within you. Emotional control is not just external, it is internal. Awareness is not just about recognizing another's tactics, it is about recognizing your own. Only when you face that internal shadow can true mastery of emotional power be achieved. Now that we have explored the architecture of emotional control, the mechanisms of jealousy, and the subtle tactics that manipulate us, consciously or unconsciously, it is time to step into the other side. The side where emotional control no longer dictates your behavior. The side where awareness transforms vulnerability into power, and where emotional stability becomes your ultimate shield. True mastery begins with recognition, recognizing that the patterns you experience are not random, recognizing that emotional triggers, whether jealousy, insecurity, or desire for attention, are universal, predictable, and manipulable, recognizing that the human mind is not always rational and that attachment wiring is often more powerful than intellect. Recognition is not judgment, it is observation. It is the first step toward reclaiming control. Once recognition occurs, detachment becomes possible. Detachment does not mean coldness. It does not mean indifference. It does not mean withdrawing from relationships entirely. Detachment is the conscious separation of your internal stability from external fluctuations. It is the ability to observe someone's behavior, their games, their subtle manipulations without internalizing them, without reacting unconsciously, without allowing their strategy to destabilize your emotional equilibrium. To achieve this state, you must first confront your own shadow. The shadow is the part of you that craves validation, that enjoys being desired, that takes subtle satisfaction in triggering attention. The shadow is not evil. It is human. It exists in everyone, and it is often unconscious, guiding behavior beneath the surface of awareness. If ignored, it can lead you to replicate manipulative patterns yourself, even unintentionally. If acknowledged, it becomes a powerful tool for self-mastery. Confronting your shadow begins with brutal honesty. Ask yourself, why do I care so much about being chosen? Why does someone's attention feel like a measure of my worth? When I provoke jealousy in others, what am I seeking? recognition, power, reassurance. Once you can answer these questions honestly, you disarm the compulsion that allows emotional control to work against you. Next comes the art of internal anchoring. Anchoring is creating a stable sense of self that does not depend on external validation. It is developing confidence that is impervious to withdrawal of attention, subtle comparison, or social proof. Anchoring requires repeated practice, noticing emotional triggers, labeling them, and choosing not to react automatically. It requires observing the patterns around you and deciding consciously which battles are worth your attention and which are not. Equally important is mastering emotional pacing. The most potent manipulators are not aggressive, they are strategic in timing. They know when to withdraw and when to offer warmth. By learning to pace your own emotional responses, you regain control. You decide when to invest, when to withhold, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Timing, in this sense, becomes your tool rather than theirs. Another layer is selective engagement. You cannot control others, but you can control where you place your energy. Not every slight, every distance, every perceived slight deserves your attention. By selectively engaging only where alignment exists, you conserve emotional energy and reduce exposure to manipulation. This is not avoidance. It is strategic focus. Boundaries, both internal and external, are your final armor. Internal boundaries are mental and emotional lines you refuse to cross unconsciously. External boundaries are the behaviors you enforce in relationships. They might be physical, verbal, or digital, anything that protects your attention and stability. Boundaries are not punitive, they are self-preserving. They are the practical manifestation of the internal stability that manipulative strategies cannot penetrate. Integration of awareness, anchoring, pacing, selective engagement, and boundaries leads to emotional untouchability. Emotional untouchability is not arrogance or isolation. It is presence, it is clarity. It is the ability to exist fully in relationships without losing your center. It is the realization that the power of emotional control is not in domination, but in stability, and that once your stability is self-generated, it cannot be taken away. But even the untouchable must practice empathy. Mastery of emotion does not mean manipulation of others. It means understanding human nature, including your own shadow, and navigating it consciously. The ultimate goal is not to provoke jealousy, nor to control others, but to engage with awareness, authenticity, and alignment. Power is no longer a weapon against others, it is a tool for self-liberation. Let us revisit the 7 psychological mechanisms we explored earlier, now through the lens of mastery. Scarcity no longer tempts you because your value is self-defined. Strategic comparison loses influence because you measure yourself against internal standards, not external cues. Intermittent reinforcement no longer hijacks your brain because you recognize patterns and stabilize expectations. Social proof no longer dictates desire because your alignment is intrinsic, not extrinsic. Controlled vulnerability is shared consciously, not manipulated unconsciously. Emotional mirroring no longer misleads because you understand the intent behind it. And the implied threat of replacement is neutralized because you do not derive security from being chosen, you derive it from self-anchoring. Mastery is not achieved overnight. It requires awareness, reflection, and repeated practice. Every time you pause before reacting, every time you notice your shadow and integrate it, every time you anchor yourself, worth internally rather than externally, you strengthen the resilience that renders emotional control ineffective. And the more stable you become, the less reactive you are to manipulative energy, the more clear your relationships become, and the more authentic your presence grows. Ultimately, emotional control is a mirror. It reflects both the manipulator and the manipulated. It reflects the subtle power dynamics of connection, desire, and attachment, and it reflects the parts of ourselves we rarely examine. Those who understand this reflection are no longer passive participants in emotional games. They are conscious observers. They are steady presences. They are untouchable not because they dominate others, but because they have mastered themselves. As we reach the conclusion of this journey, remember the deepest power does not lie in controlling another's mind, emotions, or reactions. It lies in mastering your own. Emotional control, when recognized and understood, ceases to be a weapon used against you. It becomes a lens through which you understand yourself and others. It becomes a tool to live consciously, to engage authentically, and to navigate human connection without losing your center. And here is the final truth. Once you realize that no one can destabilize you without your consent, once you embrace your own worth independently of attention, and once you confront and integrate your shadow desires, you are free. Free from the cycles of insecurity, comparison, and manipulation. Free to choose your responses consciously. Free to exist as a fully anchored, emotionally unshakable being. This is the culmination of understanding dark psychology, emotional control, and human attachment. not as a manual for manipulation, but as a guide for mastery, not as a strategy to provoke others, but as a philosophy to protect and empower yourself. Because the true weapon is not in controlling others, it is in mastering your own mind. And in mastering your own mind, you unlock the deepest, most authentic power there is, the power to live consciously, freely, and unshakably.